Welcome to the Runout. I am your host, Neil Barrett. Today we have so much to talk about. We'll get into the release of the WLL branding, AU Pro Lacrosse closing its doors, and the Zed Williams trade. But like I said, there is a lot to talk about, so let's get into it. First up, the WLL took to Sports Center and unveiled their 4 team names and branding for those teams. The 4 teams are the Boston Guard, the Maryland Charm, the New York Charging, and the California Palms. As for the locations, there's nothing all that surprising. In my previous episodes, we have said that New York, Boston, and Maryland were basically locks. New York and Maryland are just definites. When you're going to start a lacrosse league, you can pretty much expect a New York team and a Maryland team. And Boston, with the inclusion of Charlotte North and the current form of Boston College, it felt like a big deal, especially now that the Boston Cannons are back. It felt like such an easy thing to just kind of pair those two and go. And California is maybe sort of a surprise, but I did mention them as a place that I thought was likely. I didn't have them as maybe my favorite, but I did half expect that they would be on the short list, so not totally surprised to see them either. As for the branding, generally speaking, kind of across the board, I think these are better than the PLL brands from last year. They feel cleaner, more modern, less animated. The PLL brands have that real like animated style about them, and overall they're just more representative of what I think a professional sports branding should look like. Lots of people complained that these identities are all tied into PLL counterparts, but I think that's very intentional. I think these teams will be together a good amount. I expect to see the Boston Guard during the PLL weekend in Boston in some form. I don't know that they'll necessarily be playing a game or, even some kind of sixes competition or anything, but I think they'll at least be there marketing. They'll have players from the roster there in the fan zone that doing meet and greets and stuff. I think this is a lot like the early days of the WNBA, where most teams were placed in a city and tied to the NBA team that was also in that city. For instance, in Charlotte, we had the Charlotte Hornets as the NBA team and the Charlotte Sting as the WNBA team. They had similar logos, similar colors, similar uniforms, and they really tried to capitalize on that connection. But also, much like the WNBA, I expect these brands to grow and evolve and separate themselves in certain ways. What those look like, we don't know. That remains to be seen. But it is kind of the idea of linking them together to capitalize on those things. Like I said, having the Boston Guard at the Boston Cannons PLL homecoming weekend this summer will be one of those ways that they try and draw these two together. So that's at least kind of the idea behind linking them together. But let's get into the names and branding. It's been a little over a week since they were announced, and I'm still unsure of how I want to really rank these things. So let's go through them in the order that they were announced. This is not my order of importance or anything. First up was the Boston Guard. Their captain is Charlotte North. I really liked this when it first came up, but the more I've seen of it, the more it bugs me on a very small scale. Again, these are kind of nitpicky things. I am professionally a graphic designer, so while that doesn't mean that my opinion is right, I do look at it in a more critical way. And I don't mean that negatively. I don't mean critical negatively. I mean, like, I look at it and critique it in a different way than your average fan. So the more I've seen of this, the more it bugs me. I love the writer. I love all the things that they did. It feels obviously like Paul Revere, like that's what it's supposed to look like, but it is very feminine. If you look at the face, the hair, it is very feminine. It is a female writer. So I love the writer. Something about the font works for me. I look at it and I'm like, oh, it's terrible, but it kind of works in a weird way. I don't love, however, some of the word marks that they've used. The Boston with the hat on it, I'm not a fan of. That feels goofy and kind of tacked on. And while we're talking about tacked on, the rider on the main logo feels tacked on. It feels after the fact. It feels like they had two separate elements and just kind of stuck the rider on top of it. So I'm not. So like I said, there is something about the logo that the more I look at it, the less I like it, even though I like 98% of the logo. Something about it just kind of is off for me. The next team is the New York Charging. Their captain is Izzy Skane. Let's just come out and say it. Charging is a terrible name. It seems obvious that Charge was the way to go. It hits all the same marks, but works infinitely better with all of the other names. If you think about it, Guard, Charm, Palms, Charge, like they're all basically, 2-3 syllables, whatever it is, and it works. I don't know why they decided to go with Charging, but the name aside, I love this logo. The bull is what the Atlas logo should have been, even if they only wanted to use the head. It feels professional. It feels good. I don't know. I like that New York Charging bull so much, and wish they had done something like that for the Atlas. The bad shape with the kind of bolt at the top works so well. I love it. I love everything about this. Again, name aside. The third team is the Maryland Charm. They are captained by Alex Ost-Holman. In the immediate aftermath, this was my favorite logo. Just right off the bat, I just liked everything about it. Sort of like the Guard logo, the more I have seen of this logo, the more I have wanted to make small tweaks here and there. But the difference between these two is that the Charm logo has all the elements already there. I just would tweak some layout things and move some things around, but otherwise I really, really like it. I like all of the elements. Some people wanted to complain about the inclusion of a snake, but again, I think that's pretty clearly, obviously, to link them to the Whipsnakes and will ultimately evolve over time. I like the snake forming the letter C. I like the anchor. I like everything about it. I like the name. I like the colors. Everything works for me. Again, I would make a few small tweaks, and really, I think it could be something pretty cool. And the last team is the California Palms. They are captained by Ali Mastroianni. And the last team is the California Palms. They are captained by Ali Mastroianni. A little inside baseball here. That's the third time I've said her name, and you won't have heard that, but know that took me 3 times, and I'm not even sure I said that correctly. I don't know why I can't say it. I can say it in my head, but pulling it out of my mouth, it just isn't working. Anyway, Ali being the captain kind of threw me for a loop because Lizzie Colson was one of the 4 people that was involved with the announcement of the league, and I just assumed that those 4 would be the 4 team captains. But Lizzie took to Instagram this week and made a post that seemed to be indicating that she was going to be playing for the Maryland Charm. So there is that. As for the design, this is probably my least favorite of the 4. Again, across the board, I think these are good logos and are better than what the PLL did last year, but this is probably my least favorite. I think Palms is a really good name. I like that. That gradient, though, is really tough for me. Again, as a designer, gradients and logos are pretty much a no-no because they are so hard to reproduce. So that just in and of itself was tough for me to see, but also the colors of that gradient just aren't working for me. I'm not entirely sure why, but the pink is really killing it for me. It feels like it should either be more of a just orange yellow gradient to kind of go with that green, or that green should be changed to something that goes with the pink better, because one way or the other, like the pink and the green, it's just too harsh. There's something about it that I just don't like. I think I'm going to do a more in-depth look at all of the WLL branding in a couple of weeks on my YouTube channel, and that is one of the things that I'll go over. So keep an eye out for that on my YouTube channel sometime in the next few weeks, probably after the holidays. Elsewhere in women's lacrosse, AU Pro Sports announced the suspension of its Pro Lacrosse League, citing the international competition schedule and, quote, the availability of the sport's most elite athletes during the summer months over the next few years. That's really weird, considering that the next Women's World Championship isn't till 2026, with the Olympics another 2 years after that. And both the 2022 Women's Field Championships and the 2024 Women's Box Championships both happened without affecting AU. This seems pretty clearly like a response to the creation of the WLL, which is really interesting, because if you watch the WLL's press conference, they specifically stated that they were going to allow players to play in AU this summer. The only thing that I can think of is that AU saw the writing on the wall that the WLL was coming, and even if they could have had an AU season this year or next year, the WLL was at some point going to launch a full league, and AU would lose its player base, and decided, with that being on the horizon, that they would just go ahead and pull the plug rather than continuing to invest money into something they knew would not be around. I don't have any inside information on that, but that's just the only thing that I can really think of as to why. And this brings us to the next logical question, which is, what will the WLL do now? Will they ramp up and try and launch a full league this summer? While that is certainly an option and not out of the realm of possibility, I do believe that the smarter decision, as much as I want to see these players on the field showcasing their talents and getting paid, I think it's just to continue with the plan that they have in this moment, and not trying to rush this thing and get it onto the field as quickly as possible in absence of the AU Pro League. I think they'll just kind of keep pushing forward. I have no inside information here, but I've said many times that I would expect to see a showcase of the league during the All-Star game weekend, and potentially some exhibition games during the home weekends of the four teams. It would be an opportunity to showcase what the WLL game will look like, since they're playing sixes at the championship series in February. This will give them an opportunity to kind of set down some rules that they can test and work out any flaws in the WLL game before they launch a full league in 2025. This is similar to what the MLL did in the summer of 2000, when they collected some of the best players in the world to do a traveling showcase under the MLL brand before launching the full league in the summer of 2001. I have said from pretty much the announcement of the WLL that the All-Star Game seemed like the perfect place to put on some kind of showcase event. They could do 2 All-Star rosters as opposed to doing 4 fully fleshed out rosters. They can showcase what the WLL version of women's lacrosse is going to look like. I would imagine it to be on the same field as a PLL game, with the same lines and markings and everything, and a modified rule set that plays somewhat similarly to how the PLL plays compared to NCAA lacrosse. I would expect the WLL to have some similar changes compared to what NCAA women's lacrosse looks like. What exactly that looks like, I don't know. But again, I think the All-Star game could be the perfect showcase event. And then the WLL teams can travel around the rest of the time and do much more kind of marketing stuff. Again, like I said, similar to what the MLL did in the summer of 2000. Now let's talk some NLL. This will be a relatively quick rundown of week 3 because I didn't get to watch any of the games due to Christmas events with my family this weekend. But Buffalo continued to roll, barely getting out of first gear against Ottawa, winning 18-7. They are still far and away the favorites for the NLL championship this season. Moving on to Calgary, Dane Doby dropped 8 goals in the fourth quarter in overtime to power the Roughnecks to a 13-12 come from behind victory. The highlights were incredible. It reminded me so much of watching Brennan O'Neill and Charlotte take over down the stretch and just put the team on his back and win. Dane Doby does it all. I read a stat this week that when Dane Doby and Jesse King both start for the Roughnecks, they are 9-0. They have never lost a game, and that is a good sign for the Roughnecks as long as those two can stay healthy. Speaking of Brennan O'Neill, he put on a Rookie of the Week performance with 4 goals and an assist to add to Holden Katoni's 9 assists and Joe Resaterit's 11 points as the Wings ran out to a 19-10 win in their opening home game. That was pretty cool to see Brennan O'Neill adapting to the indoor game that quickly. It's been a lot of fun to track his progress, and I am hoping and praying that at some point this season we get an what in the hell is happening? An NLL Wings game day roster with Brennan O'Neill and Michael Sowers on it. He was there this weekend taking in some practice, which was really cool to see him on the turf in Philadelphia. And I hope that we get to see him for a game at some point this season. The last notable game of the weekend came from Georgia, where Lyle Thompson scored the game-winning goal with 1 minute on the clock as the Swarm moved to 2-0 by beating the Toronto Rock 10-9. The Georgia Swarm have become one of the more fun teams to follow right now, and Lyle Thompson is proving to be every bit of the best player in the world. Obviously, there are several guys with some claims to that. Jeff Teat will have something to say about that, obviously, but Lyle Thompson is that dude until proven otherwise. Looking ahead to this weekend, there are 4 games. The Wings head out to Las Vegas to face the Desert Dogs in the return leg, for those of you who are into soccer and know what that means, of their matchup from this past weekend. With the way that game went this past weekend, you would have to imagine that the Wings grab another victory here and move to 2-1. Georgia heads to San Diego to take on the Seals in a rematch of their incredible overtime game in week 2. Given the nature of the last game, I want to take the Seals at home, and I wanted to say that it would be more comfortable than the game in Georgia, but just last night it was announced that Trevor Baptiste is injured and will not play, and I'm not entirely sure how much that affects the Seals. Faceoffs are slightly different in the NLL. I have noticed that in the brief time that I've been watching. So I'm not sure how much of an impact that has, but I definitely think that now means the game is likely to be closer than I had originally thought it would be. In the third game, Halifax heads to Colorado to take on the Mammoth. This game could be really interesting as it's 2 teams that we kind of don't know a ton about. Halifax, despite its immensely talented roster, is 0-2, but they have played two of the better looking teams so far this season in the Rush and the Roughnecks. Meanwhile, the Mammoth are in exactly the opposite position, coming into the game at 2-1, but having beaten the lesser teams in Vancouver and Las Vegas. So I think this game is probably pretty close and fun, but I think Halifax probably pulls it out in the end. And in our final game this weekend, Saskatchewan heads to Rochester for what, at least on paper, should be a relatively easy win for the Rush. The Nighthawks have had good stretches of offense and good stretches of defense, but have yet to put it all together and have those at the same time. Meanwhile, the Rush have been one of the stories of the season so far. Again, we're only heading into week 4, so it's still early, but so far they are definitely one of the teams to be watching out for. And finally, in some PLL news this week, the Whipsnakes have traded former MVP Zed Williams to the Waterdogs in exchange for Matt Brandow, and there's a pick swap in there as well. The Waterdogs get an absolute bucket on the right side to form arguably the best attack line in the league. I'm not even sure who's in that conversation beyond the Waterdogs. That Waterdogs attack line is so stacked. The Whips continue their youth movement, though, with a promising young talent to add to TJ Malone and Levi Anderson. All that being said, a lot of people are calling this a fair trade. I find this trade to be fairly lopsided, at least at this point. You are trading a 29-year-old MVP of this league for a rookie who scored 4 goals last season. In order to get fair value, you need Matt Brandow to be a 25-point player this coming season. When Dan Arestia announced this trade was happening, before all of the details were sorted out, I thought it would be Zed for Brandow and a pick, which feels more even to me, getting 2 players for 1. But then again, no trade in the PLL has ever really made much sense. So I guess that's just par for the course. I've seen a lot of people speculating that the Whips were moving him on because they know that he only has a year or 2 left and they wanted to get value for him now before he left for free. But this is a 29-year-old attackman who's built like a linebacker and passionately loves playing lacrosse. He has always felt more like John Grant Jr. to me, and someone that is going to basically have to be dragged off of the lacrosse field than someone who was going to retire at the age of 31. This is also a really weird conversation because why Zed and not Matt Rambo? Matt Rambo is older, had less output this past season, and seems to be closer to retirement than Zed. The only kind of caveat to that statement being that Matt Rambo does seem to be kind of directly tied to the culture of that Whipsnakes team. I don't know if he's a captain, but he is certainly one of the more important characters, as well as being a Maryland guy and a Tewaaraton winner and everything. So he is more directly tied to the culture of the Whipsnakes team than Zed is. But that aside, it makes way more sense for them to get rid of Matt Rambo than Zed Williams. So I don't really understand this trade on a lot of levels, even though I think it could potentially work out for both teams, depending on what Matt Brandow becomes and who that 3rd round pick becomes as well. But more interesting, perhaps, is looking at what this does to the draft. The Whips now own 3 picks in the 3rd round. I'm not in the know enough to even begin to formulate ideas of what they might do with those picks, but suffice it to say, they have a ton of capital to flesh out their roster in whatever way they choose, whether that be through trades or pick just using the picks or whatever they choose to do, they have a lot of leeway to build out the rest of their roster. The Dogs, on the other hand, now have 3 of the first 15 picks in this upcoming draft. And so the question becomes, with the attack pretty much locked in for next season with Zed, Michael Sowers, and Kieran McCardle, what do they do with the number 1 pick? Do you grab the presumed number 1 pick, CJ Kirst, as kind of a long-term replacement for Kieran McCardle and just run him out of the box for the next season or 2 until Kieran McCardle retires? Or do you address another need now and replace Kieran McCardle down the line? I have in the past said that in this league, at least as it's currently constructed, this could change down the line, that the margins are too thin and teams go from first to worst and back to first in the blink of an eye. And so you should always take the best player available and figure out how to make it work, because schemes change, coaches change, everything in this league changes so quickly that you take the best player available and you figure it out. I don't think I'm changing that opinion today. So if it was me, I would take CJ Kirst number 1 as a long-term replacement for Kieran McCardle and figure out how to fit him into the offense in the meantime. That being said, that is at least partially because I don't see any midfielders or poles or any other position that are even close to CJ in terms of talent at this point. It's pretty clearly CJ at 1, Chris Kavanaugh at 2, and then there seems to be kind of a gap because then there are about 8 players kind of vying for that number 3 spot. But by the time the draft actually rolls around, that might completely change, and so too might my answer. But for right now, that's where I'm at. I think you take CJ Kirst, number 1, with an eye towards him being a long-term replacement in that attack line for Kieran McCardle. That is it for today, and this is unfortunately the last episode of 2024. With the holidays coming up in the next few weeks, I am going to take a much needed break and spend some time with my family, and I really, really hope that you get the chance to do the same. If you are enjoying the podcast, do me a favor and like, comment, subscribe, leave a review, share it with a friend, all those good things. I really appreciate it. The feedback I've been getting on the show has been very good, and it really does help the show grow when you do those things. All right, I'll see you guys next year.